Welcome back. After the last week traveling the country, it's good to be home, no longer doing travel logs, taking cameras with us wherever we go, and the nicest part of all, well, we can actually see movies in the theater again, and not just on the plane. Today we're going to go and talk about a film called Greta that I saw this week. It just came into theaters. We're also going to discuss what I call the What About Bob type of thriller.
I don't know what to say.
What do I mean when I say the What About Bob type of thriller? Well, there's a lot of movies that have a similar kind of formula to them. If you look at Pacific Heights, if you look at Fatal Attraction, if you look at The Gift from 2015, they all follow a similar kind of plot, not unlike the 1980s comedy with Bill Murray, What About Bob? In What About Bob, the formula works as follows. Individual 1, Richard Dreyfuss, meets Individual 2, Bill Murray. They are connected in some capacity, and eventually, Individual 1 realizes that Individual 2 is not only batshit insane, but also that they will not go away. You can't get them out of your life. And while What About Bob is a comedy, in many ways it's oddly terrifying. Another component of that is in movies like Fatal Attraction. It's very similar. It's Glenn Close enters Michael Douglas's life. It turns out that she is completely batshit insane, and she is now a violent and volatile threat to him and his safety. In movies like this, there really is kind of a tried and true formula. And that's not a bad thing, as I discussed with the review of Happy Death Day to You. It's one of those things where I'm less concerned about if you've taken an idea, and I'm more curious to see how you can transform it. And I'm noticing now that these are two movies that feature Bill Murray, so I find that very curious. Today we're going to talk specifically about the film Greta by Neil Jordan. You may remember him as the director of The Crying Game and Interview with the Vampire. He also, unfortunately, made the god-awful remake of We're No Angels. The original is one of my favorite movies, and the remake made me hate him for life. But it's also a movie that has Stephen Reeve from The Crying Game returning, as well as Isabelle Huppert as the eponymous Greta, and Chloe Grace Moretz as your protagonist. So to review this movie and to see whether it did something kind of transformative, let's walk through Greta through the What About Bob prism.
I don't know what to say.
All right, Act 1 in these types of movies is very simple. It's an opportunity for the screenwriter to explore your protagonist and your antagonist as they meet each other and have dialogue explaining to each other who they are. In this period, you're going to figure out their wants and desires, their secrets, their weaknesses, and their strengths. And you have to in this area because the rest of the movie is kind of a cat and mouse game traditionally. And more often than not, the third act is your antagonist utilizing the weaknesses that they've learned about to get under the skin of the protagonist. And the protagonist invariably finding something at the end that they need to overcome in themselves to be able to finally rid themselves of this curse. So Act 1 is what I would call entering the spider's web. You don't know what you're doing. You're maybe chasing some food. It was flying around. You don't even see it coming. And before you know it, you're trapped. Act 1 in this film, Chloe Grace Moretz finds a handbag on a subway car. She opens it up, figures out who it belongs to, and takes it to the home of a woman named Greta, played by Isabelle Huppert. And Greta is a recently widowed woman who lives alone. And Chloe Grace Moretz is a young waitress who recently lost her mother, new to the city of New York, and it seems like an obvious pairing, and they quickly bond. Unfortunately, that's kind of all you really learn about the two through the first act. I mean, a little bit here and there, but the first act, while short on character development, which I think kind of harms the film going forward, does have a lot of foreshadowing that I'll get to later.
I don't know what to say.
Act 2 is that moment where you just realize how in the shit your protagonist is. It's when, Bob shows up at the vacation. It's when Michael Keaton is no longer just a renter from hell, but also a psychopath. It's that moment where you realize just how bad the situation is, because you knew it was going to go in this direction. You wouldn't have come to the film otherwise. It's the sales pitch. It's in the trailer. You know it. I know it. We all knew it. But the question is, how is it expressed? What is the impetus for that realization? In this case, it's Chloe Grace Moretz finding a cupboard full of these handbags and realizing that for whatever reason, Greta has pulled this stunt many times before. And there are a lot of questions that aren't asked that again lead to an interesting third act. Like, for instance, what happened to the other people who brought back those handbags? And through the second act is really, I think, where a movie like this becomes memorable or completely forgettable. It's a section where I think the writers, more often than not, have a really good idea of a beginning and of their characters and of a conclusion and kind of what the moral of the story is. And the second act, more often than not, is kind of that period of finding 4 or 5 scenes, 4 or 5 ways to create memorable tension, horror, some jump factors. It's your period for having the boiling bunny in the pot. That's what the second act typically is. And unfortunately, in a movie like this, I really feel like it would have been better as a short story or a short film about half an hour long, because if you took some of the best elements from Act 1 and almost the entirety of Act 3, that's a great movie. A lot of the stuff that happens in Act 2, it really feels like they weren't committed to or passionate about. It kind of felt like it wasn't authentic to the characters and who they really were, and kind of the nature of the threat of Greta and who she is as an antagonist. It's kind of just stuff that's weird and uncomfortable, and in some ways to draw out how helpless the main character is. But I feel like it's been done a lot better in other movies, and I felt like there were a lot of small plot holes that, while kind of debatable as most plot holes are, pulled me out of the film. So by this point, if I were watching on Netflix or on TV, I would not have stuck around.
I don't know what to say.
I am really glad that I stuck around, though, because Act 3 is certainly interesting and the closest this film gets to transforming this niche of the thriller genre. It's a section where I think the character of Greta, similar to, on a much smaller scale, like the movie Audition, you finally understand the breadth of the threat of this woman. And that was really interesting to me. And seeing a little bit more of her pathos, or kind of her the way that she would take advantage of people, the way that she gets power over people, that to me was really interesting and kind of rewarding in that sense, and very dark. The third act is very, very dark, and Chloe Grace Moretz does a wonderful job really just evoking this terror and almost like a Stockholm Syndrome kind of series of emotions. And Hugh Perry does a wonderful job really just riding one or two emotions throughout the entirety of this movie and being kind of haunting in that way. And that's the biggest thing about these kinds of movies. It's really how profound that person is. I mean, Glenn Close is far more a reason for why her role in Fatal Attraction is memorable, more than just how that character was written. The script of The Gift, conversely, is something that I think was a lot more memorable than the performances and the quality of the actors. And in this case, it's more like the former. You've got a really talented actress who is given kind of room to play around with this character, but she's limited a bit by the lack of development and kind of just the lack of internal logic, I felt. But in the end, despite all of the side characters that I thought were ineffective, despite a lot of the scares that I thought were unnecessary or tacky, and despite some of the lack of internal logic, it's a film that does a really good job of expanding out exponentially for about an hour and a half and really coming back down to a nice, coherent climax for the last half hour or so. I would say that maybe I would have cut it before the last scene, so about 5-7 minutes before when the film actually ends, because I was really excited that the movie might have some sort of darker or at least unique kind of ending to it, something that would have been more resonant with me and been more thought-provoking. As it stands, I wouldn't say it's a bad kind of an ending. I wouldn't say that the movie does a disservice to the audience, but it definitely felt like something that came up through like a focus group than through like the passionate view of a writer. It absolutely follows the beats, in my opinion, of almost every film in the What About Bob thriller niche. If you're looking for a great example of a movie like that and you haven't seen The Gift, go see it. If you haven't seen Fatal Attraction, that's also really good. I mean, there are just a handful of movies that are like that, that are profoundly good, that create a nice bit of tension and have, I think, more memorable characters. If you are someone that loves that genre, though, and you just want to kind of hang out and watch a movie like that, I think this is a valid contribution to that niche, and I don't think that somebody who loves that kind of movie would be disappointed. So for that audience, I would recommend it. For everybody else, though, to me, it would feel like when you recommend a TV show and you say, well, once you get through the first 4 episodes or so, it's pretty good. So just do that and then tell me what you think. It's one of those things where at that point, I had better be right in my recommendation, otherwise you've wasted so much time. And for me, I found validation in the third act and climax of this movie. I wouldn't see it again, and I would struggle to recommend it to someone who listened to this review and said, I'm not really sure if that's my kind of movie. I think I've made it pretty clear what kind of movie it is. And if that sounds appealing to you, then it probably is. And obviously I don't do grades or anything like that, but I would say it's perfectly in the middle. It's exactly what I expected. Some things were better than I expected, some things were worse. And despite having a really good cast and crew behind it, which got me excited to go out and see it, it really did feel like a kind of movie that could have been made by almost anybody. And with the exception of a few shots, like Isabelle Huppert's feet fluttering as she's running through a home like a insane ballerina, with the exception of a few moments, it was just a kind of a forgettable film, but an enjoyable experience. So I guess you have a choice, unlike Chloe Grace Moretz, but I'll warn you, if you go see Greta, that bitch don't go away.